What are you seeing on your screen right now? The ballet? Maybe you recognize that it's Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky. Maybe you can even tell that it's the Dance of the Cygnets from the second act. To me, it's a symbol of anti-Putin protest. To my parents' generation, it's a sign to whip out the vodka from the fridge. But why? And what does ballet have to do with political upheaval? In 1875, Tchaikovsky was commissioned by Vladimir Begishev, the director of the Russian Imperial Theater at the time, to write a score for the libretto for Swan Lake, which our composer friend accepted, by his own admission, because he saw it as an opportunity to both secure the bag and take on a creative challenge. In a letter dated 10th of September the same year, he writes, "At the behest of the Moscow Directorate, I am writing the music for the ballet The Lake of Swans. I took this work on partly for the money, which I need, and partly because I have long wanted to try my hand at writing this type of music." I've seen claims that he had initially written the draft for the ballet 4 years earlier, in 1871, for his nieces and nephews. But as we all know, posts on the internet are not a reliable source. Claim, as per Wiley's research, comes from Tchaikovsky's nephew by the name of Yuri Lvovich Davidov, who was only born 5 years later, whereas the relatives who were alive at the time point to a different date. Anna Meg Davidov, for one, places it around 1867, but that's kind of beside the point. Swan Lake initially bombed and was topping the flop charts of 1877, with critics writing, "The music of the new ballet is quite monotonous and boring, and from the technical standpoint, the musical score of Swan Lake does not stand up to criticism." There were, of course, real Tchaikovsky fanboys out there, but they were outnumbered. It was only after the composer's death in 1893 that Swan Lake was finally revived and appreciated for its contribution to international slang. Today, Swan Lake is considered a timeless classic and beloved by pretentious ballet lovers, crying to classical music enthusiasts, and Natalie Portman fans alike. And its ballerinas have, in fact, danced their way through multiple revolutions. Here's the thing, even though you might get recruited to be a dancer at the ripe age of 3 and then spend your entire childhood being screamed at by retired ballerinas, ballet is actually no child's game in post-Soviet countries. The whole tutu obsession can be traced back to Peter the Great. Thanks for founding St. P, by the way. Good call. But by the time Nicholas II was shaken in his little Romanov boots, ballet had become something greater than just a form of dance. It was entangled so deeply with the highest echelons of the imperial society that our boy Nikki had a full-on affair with Matilda Krzyzinska, which was so poorly hidden, it was basically public knowledge. The two state-sponsored ballet companies, the Bolshoi and the Mariinsky theaters in Moscow and St. P, respectively, were the crown jewels of the empire, and the crème de la crème of the 19th century society embraced the artists as geniuses, bringing highbrow art to the stage. In Swans of the Kremlin, Ezrahi explains, "The students of the Imperial Ballet School were considered members of the Tsar's household. From childhood, the dancers of the Mariinsky were thus reared to take their place in a Tsarist institution that occupied a central position in the social life of the Imperial St. Petersburg." Thanks to Diaghilev and his Ballet Russe, the reputation of Russian ballet as top of the early 20th century pops was cemented all over the world. Like, one of the few things that Disney's Anastasia got right was, surprisingly, the appreciation that members of the royal family had for this art form. You know, if you were to try and catch the ex-empress in exile, ballet would probably be your safest bet. Even as Bolsheviks were besieging the Winter Palace, which, despite not being violent, as typically portrayed in the media, was still quite a shocking event, the performance in honor of Tchaikovsky's memory at the Mariinsky Theater did not stop, even despite the majority of the cast missing and most of the chairs in the audience being empty. As Tamara Karsavina, one of the few ballerinas that did make it to the stage that night, albeit an hour late, reminisced, a cannonade was faintly heard from the stage, quite plainly from the dressing rooms. Naturally, the fate of something that was so integral to the image of the Russian Empire was heavily debated when Bolsheviks came to power. They were torn between kicking the tutus to the curb as remnants of the oppressive imperial regime, or trying to preserve the cultural heritage and influence of the internationally recognized Great Pliés. The girls were, in fact, fighting, and fighting so much that both the Bolshoi and the Mariinsky almost had to close down multiple times, all while trying to bargain with the government to get some food for their dancers, who were chronically malnourished. One of the points of contention was the idea that ballet was too elite and highbrow for a typical factory worker or farmer, but after a project that included free tickets for the proletariat was set in motion, it quickly became apparent that old classical performances were actually more popular with that crowd than the avant-garde stuff that catered heavily to the new establishment and the ideas and ideals of the revolution. Ultimately, the Soviet Union ended up employing ballet as part of its cultural project, aimed at both internal and external audiences. For example, one of the ways that the USSR was trying to intimidate the US during the Cold War was sending ballet performers to dance their pointy shoes off on American soil. As Sergei describes it, the Soviet government sent its artists to socialist and non-socialist countries, encompassing all 6 inhabited continents, though they spent the most money and person hours on cultural diplomacy tours in Western Europe. And nevertheless, the ballet tours were genuinely meant to make their mark on this diplomatic, economic, and military chessboard. They were as much of a daring leap as a ballerina's flying fish dive. Goldsman, when analyzing Swan Lake's role in the Soviet Union, puts it the following way. So, the army and ballet became a kind of facade of the Soviet Union. When it was necessary to demonstrate to important foreign guests the strength and power of the country, they were invited to a military parade or a ballet performance. In Soviet Russia, you don't swan the lake swans you. Most of what is considered to be the classical ballet repertoire at Bolshoi and Mariinsky was always closer to the magical realm when it came to subjects and plots. Swan Lake, for once, is probably as far away from the typical 20th century proletarian life world as I am from the Russian authorities at any given time. This was originally seen as a potential barrier to the working class embracing the lace-clad beauties. Lopukhov described ballet being perceived as unable to deal with reality-stirring questions and an after-dinner amusement for satiated gourmets. But the fact that beautiful dancing swans were nothing like the daily lives of workers turned out to be the main selling point. After all, the abused proletarian spirit always seeks that sweet, sweet escapism, no matter the century. Over the course of the Soviets' existing, ballet, while retaining its crown jewel status, was transformed from the exclusive entertainment available both physically and culturally to the elites and the elites only, to a form of art that could be appreciated by anyone and used to demonstrate how pseudo-anti-capitalism apparently makes you better at pliés and arabesques. Don't get me wrong, you'd still have to battle it out with Marina from the next office over and do a lot of scheming in order to obtain tickets for the Nutcracker at Mariinsky on New Year's Eve, and going to see the Swans dance was not a regular hangout activity among the Soviet masses by any means, but it was no longer a type of event for crème de la crème only. Stuart Hall, among others, argues that meaning is constantly being produced and exchanged in every personal and social interaction in which we take part, and that the relationship between a signifier and its signified is the result of a system of social conventions specific to each society and to specific historical moments. Then all meanings are produced within history and culture.
What does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean?
Meanings, therefore, are not fixed in stone, but subjects to constant change, despite the subject's ability to remain the same, and will most likely differ from society to society, whether geographically, temporarily, or whatever the fuck else. To my American bestie, calling someone a comrade means you're an evil spy from communist Russia. To me, the evil spy from communist Russia in question, it's nothing more than a synonym for friend or acquaintance. The transformation that ballet underwent as a result of the revolution is an example of that process of negotiation, but one piece in particular, Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, has probably taken some of the most dramatic turns over the course of its existence. Pass the remote, I'll show you. November 10th, 1982 was supposed to be your average working day with some celebrations of the Soviet police peppered in, but then a certain something happened. Instead of a gala concert in honor of the supposed servers and protectors, all the TV channels started playing Swan Lake. But why?
High atop the Kremlin tonight, a Soviet flag at half-staff, a symbol of mourning for Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev.
Скоропостижно скончался генеральный секретарь Центрального комитета Коммунистической партии Советского Союза, председатель Президиума Верховного Совета СССР Леонид Ильич Брежнев.
Joining us tonight, former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig to discuss Brezhnev's death and its impact.
Since all the TV channels in USSR, around 6 in the big cities, were owned by the government, a breaking news type of situation was about as likely as Brezhnev not Frenching the man he worked with. Thus, when an urgent fill-in to replace the program schedule was needed, virtually all media employed the same tactic, turning to the classics.
So I was familiar with Swan Lake, of course. They played it on the radio once in a while. But that was the first time when suddenly regular programming stopped and they just started playing classical music on the radio. And then you turn TV on and it's a Swan Lake, on every channel. That was the first time I realized there's something is going on because suddenly, basically, the whole mass media stopped. When you go to school in the Soviet Union, it's like we never had snow days. But that was the very first time when they canceled school. So today no classes, that was the day of the funeral. And we all gathered in a gym, спортивный зал, sat on the mats, and there was a little TV, and we all watched the funeral, then we went home. So that was like, oh wow, it's kind of cool, not to have school for a day, just with kids. It's a different standard.
And then it happened again.
News from Moscow that Soviet President Yuri Andropov has died yesterday afternoon at about 5 o'clock.
Let's now go right to Peter Jennings with the latest on Andropov's death. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, David, and I must say that you have the headline and we don't know a great deal other than that. There were some partial signs because Soviet programming, jazz programming in one instance, was interrupted and classical music was put on.
Soviet citizens got the word from official television, and after a lengthy program of somber music, the statement was read also on Moscow radio.
And then, of course, Andropov became our new leader, and he looked pretty young and healthy, but then whatever happened. So when he died, the same situation occurred. They started playing music on the radio, Swan Lake on TV. So once again, we had a day off. We had a funeral, sit on the mats in the gym. I was like, okay, I kind of like this, rhythm going. We got, instead of snow day, we have a fallen day, fallen leader day.
And then it happened again.
Good evening. Here's what's happening. The world is getting mysterious signals from the Soviet Union. They give every indication that Soviet leader Konstantin Chernenko may be dead. However, there is no official confirmation of that as yet. The best indication he may have died comes from the State Department. An official there told me tonight that Soviet radio and TV suddenly began playing somber music tonight. Now, that usually signals the death of an important Soviet official.
Chernenko's tenure in the Kremlin was brief and by and large ineffective. He was sick and away from his office here for a third of his presidency.
And then it happened again.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
But first, that explosion at a nuclear plant in the Soviet Union. What caused it, and how many people did it hurt? Scanty information has come so far from the Soviets.
So April of 1986, when Chernobyl exploded, and that's happened on Saturday night. So I was home on Sunday, because, if you're in school, you don't hear classical music. My dad always had his radio a little bit on. He just as a background noise, and then suddenly on Sundays they started playing classical music on the radio, and then my first thought was Gorbachev died, and I was shocked, like, man, dude is so young, what happened, why did he die? And then there was just classical music and nothing, and then rumors, because I lived in Kiev, which is pretty close to Chernobyl, right? So we had rumors pretty quick that something happened at Chernobyl power plant, and it's pretty ugly since they play classical music, no news. But that was my confusion also. I thought first that it was Gorbachev passed away, that's why they play classical music, but that was actually Chernobyl.
And then guess what? It happened again, except there were tanks involved, and it lasted 3 full days.
Mingling with the rush hour traffic, Red Army armored personnel carriers on the streets of Moscow this morning.
There are tanks in the streets of Moscow, and Mr. Gorbachev is gone.
The playing of somber music on Soviet television was one of the first clues here that something had happened. Some people thought someone important had died.
What you're seeing, quite obviously, is not a press conference, but a concert. Undoubtedly, you have become familiar over the years with crises that occur in Eastern European countries. Whenever they do, and they have nothing to fill with, they put on a concert.
Tanks in the streets, shots in the night, Soviet politicians involved in the coup against Mr. Gorbachev now allegedly in their sickbeds.
Already, coup leaders have taken the Soviet Union a step backward with the old trick of replacing information with classical music. Swan Lake is played endlessly on radio and TV.
He said to me, "Get ready quick. There's been a coup." He heard it from listening to the TV news and to all that Swan Lake stuff on the air.
Many theories have been brought up as to why it was almost always Swan Lake that was used in place of the regularly scheduled programming.
So it probably was the most like a neutral, safe, something to show on the TVs. I think it was basically whatever was like, hey, do you have anything handy? Oh, there's a tape, Swan Lake. Okay, let's pop it in and start get the reel going.
We'll likely never know how that decision was made, yet it makes so much sense, because it's not just about the tutus and calm, serene music, except for when it is. Tchaikovsky's initial flop, that went on to be a certified classic, is thematically close to the very events its non-stop broadcasts were covering up. Death. As Maria Goldsman describes it, the day of the death of any dictator was supposed to be a national tragedy. Swan Lake was best suited to express the sorrow, because its original libretto contained the concept of the Lake of Tears, where the main character, the White Swan, was hidden. They go on to point out the strict dichotomy we see throughout both acts, the White Swan and the Black Swan, good and evil, fantasy and reality. As Bethany Nicole posits in their thesis, that harsh line between fantasy and reality might have been indicative of what Tchaikovsky himself was feeling. The inability to live openly and happily as a gay man drove him to attempt to take his own life. Here, for example, is a letter he wrote to his friend and patron Nadezhda von Meck shortly after getting married to a woman. "I already wrote to you that I married not because of an attraction of the heart, but because of a certain, to me, incomprehensible chain of circumstances which fatefully led me to a most difficult alternative. My wife is guilty of nothing towards me. She did not solicit the bonds of marriage. Therefore, to let her feel that I do not love her, that I look upon her as an unbearable encumbrance, would be cruel and base. What remains is to pretend, but to pretend one's entire life is the greatest of tortures. I fell into deep despair, the more terrible in that there was no one to support and reassure me. I began passionately, eagerly to long for death." To Tchaikovsky, the reality and fantasy are mutually exclusive, and we can see the parallels between the author and the male protagonist. Their inability to live life the way their heart yearns for, and the choice they face between settling down and giving up, or trying to cross the line between reality and fantasy through death. To quote Goldsman once again, "Even if this fantastic world is not death, but, for example, a dream, every semiotician would say that dream is actually a cultural equivalent of death." These points are brought to the surface in the 2010 movie Black Swan. Nina's slow descent into the fantasy world represents the very same transgression of the dichotomy present in every aspect of Swan Lake. Her embodiment of both the black swan and the white swan shatters reality. And the movie, just like the original Ballet, culminates in death. Once again, reinforcing the impossibility and unreachability of the fantasy aspect. One little note though. They name-dropped Bolshoi like 2 minutes into the movie and never mentioned Mariinsky, and as a proud St. P representative, I do not approve of the Moscow Ballet School agenda being pushed to unsuspecting Westerners. God forbid those poor souls actually believe Bolshoi is superior to Mariinsky. Thematically, then, Swan Lake is simply perfect for the whole "oh shit, someone important died" or "there might be a revolution happening" shtick it was accompanying. It deals with the topics of death and transformation, yet through a magical narrative, and with music and choreography that are so demure and so mindful that they calm you down and almost hypnotize you. But I'll remind you of our friend Stuart Hall once again. Swan Lake and its imagery, like every other part of culture, is constantly being renegotiated and transformed, and we're approaching the next sharp turn. So, cell phones on silent and shut your fucking mouths. The show is about to begin. I'm gonna repeat the question from the video's intro and ask you, what are you seeing on your screen right now? It's not exactly ballet, but by now you should be able to recognize the choreo. All of these clips come from live performances of Co-op Swan Lake. Not the OG one, but the song by Noise MC, one of the legends of the Russian hip-hop scene and one of the most prolific and open critics of Putin within the same scene. He, alongside his frequent collaborator, Monetочка, also got nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, like hours before I started filming. Good for him, I guess, but I could have done without the last-minute script edits. But why are people protesting via doing questionable renditions of the Dance of the Signets? Let me give you a little context first. Ever since the Russian government started aggressively cracking down on any sort of protest action, circa 2012, taking to the streets has become increasingly more and more unsafe, especially after 2022.
Russians who come out and protest publicly risk several things. First of all, obviously, they risk being detained, which can lead to either administrative fines or prison sentences. But they also risk longer-term impacts. They might be thrown out of college or university, they might be dismissed from their job, they might come under some forms of social ostracism.
Let me establish both my credibility when it comes to protesting in Russia and illustrate the statements made in the previous sentences. Here are my arrest papers, with my name misspelled multiple times. They got me a very unpleasant and threatening talk when the police decided to pay a visit to the university I was getting my bachelor's at. A sizable, for a broke Russian student, fine, and a night in jail that smelled of piss and was located 40 minutes outside the city. I knew I was gonna need these one day, but I never thought it would be for a YouTube video about ballet, if I'm being honest. As a result, a lot of people turned to protesting in ways that were less obvious, essentially flagging, but among those who are anti-Putin.
It's almost impossible to protest in direct forms, like to go on street and say, Putin, go away. So people are starting to invent or reinvent new forms of protesting.
And Swan Lake, with its reputation of being an omen of political upheaval and instability, as well as the changing regime, has become one of those symbols. It still retains that plausible deniability of, oh, I just left Tchaikovsky, while sending a pretty clear message. A little, if you know moment, if you will. You can still buy ballet-themed postcards and shirts sporting Swan Lake Lovers Club on them on Russian marketplaces like Ozon and Wildberries, all thanks to the wiggle room provided by this form of protest, which Lana Johnson classifies as dissent art.
Yeah, I've seen these images, these like graffiti of ballerinas, right?
Yeah.
What is that?
It's like images of ballerinas from this famous Russian ballet. Because back in the late Soviet times, this ballet was a symbol of of the death of the Soviet leader. So that's why it became a sign that we are waiting Putin today.
Over the last decade, graffiti of the Dance of the Signets has been popping up all over Russia, like this one in St. P, which welcomed Putin's 2018 inauguration, or this one, or the one with the riot police doing the dance, or the one that says, "With hope in our hearts, we've been waiting for the ballet for the last 20 years. Not even to mention the countless memes that could be found in every corner of the Russian-speaking internet. In 2014, 4 ballet dancers joined forces with Amnesty International and performed some of the Swan Lake choreo in front of the Russian embassy in the UK, in protest of the Russian government passing what is known as the anti-gay law. This specific protest points to yet another dichotomy, although a less obvious one, that would come to be highlighted by the prevalence of Swan Lake in the symbolic space. The 19th century ballet was dominated by femininity. As per Nicole, in particular, the importance of the emotion in the romantic ballet is emphasized. It was ethereal, expressive, and the advanced techniques supported the female dancer. As a result, ballet became the promise of women. Ballerinas are often posed as the epitome of femininity in Russia. They have grace, yet seem fragile, which stands in complete opposition to the image Putin has been trying to put out and maintain his entire career. These 2 articles go into this in detail, but I'll just pull a quote to summarize it shortly. To the extent that there is a personality cult in contemporary Russia, the personality at the center of it is defined in highly gendered terms, shaping the tenor of both domestic and foreign policy. This image of Putin, with its emphasis on physical masculinity, was not created accidentally. Swan Lake, then, with its romantic ballet traditions that highlight femininity and a gay author, sticks out like a big middle finger to the government that is doing everything to outlaw the very existence of queer people and builds its image around the hyper-masculinity and wannabe macho shit. Just like the white swan and the black swan, they represent 2 opposing poles. But let's circle back to hip-hop. In 2023, Noise MC dropped a single titled Co-op Swan Lake, which had skull-headed ballerinas performing Dance of the Signets on its cover. Now, I'll go slightly off track to tell you that co-op named Ozera, Lake in Russian, was founded in 1996 by Putin and his lapdogs/friends, who would later go on to assume top positions in the government. Jobs like the Minister of Education and Science of the Russian Federation, which they were definitely qualified to do, hence the co-op in the song title. But the contents of the track are way more interesting. Noise turns the familiar melody into a rough, almost garage punk-like riff, thus transforming the soothing and hypnotizing sounds into a loud and aggressive in-your-face call to action. The streetwear-clad crowd, which performs renditions of the choreo at the artist's gigs, is probably as far from the 19th century ballet ideals as it could be, but that doesn't matter. What does matter is the transformation of Swan Lake imagery over the years. For instance, in 2014, after Russia dispatched troops to Crimea, ballerinas from Odessa performed Dance of the Signets for Vladimir Putin. When, in 2022, TV Rain, the only oppositional channel remaining on Russian TV, was forced to shut down, the last seconds of its livestream played Swan Lake after the entire crew exited the studio saying no to war. With Russian television, often called the zombie box, because it serves as the main vessel for pro-Putin propaganda aimed at older generations, losing its last opposition stronghold, we finally did see the Swans dance, albeit not as a symbol of change, but a manifestation of the people hoping for it. In 2023, late at night on July 23rd, Prigozhin, an owner of a private military company, attempted a coup against Putin, and at 6 a.m. the following day, Business Insider published an article entitled, "During the last attempted coup in Russia, ballet dancers alerted citizens of the turmoil. As the Wagner mercenary boss turns on the Russian military, Tchaikovsky's Swans may dance again." Now, I did not, and still don't, own a TV, but I can assure you that the tutu-wearing beauties did not hijack the broadcast. Yet the memes on TikTok did have a few graceful bursts here and there. Swan Lake, which originally reflected Tchaikovsky's pain and desperation, now represents the pain, desperation, and anger of millions of people. It went from somber and soothing to aggressive and loud. Ballet, in turn, went from crème de la crème highbrow entertainment for the Tsars and those close to them to one of the few relatively safe ways for the everyman to express their disdain for the authoritative imperialist government. And I think that's beautiful. So here's a toast to seeing the Swans dance in 2025.
Everyone is a gangster unless there is a Swan Lake on TV.
All of the money made from this video, that is both AdSense and new channel members, is going to be donated to Ukraine. There is more info in the description, and I strongly encourage you to join me. While researching for this video, I also asked my mother what she was doing during the 1991 coup, because she was either in her first year of university or like just about to start university. So, you know, she was supposed to be in the thick of it. And that woman told me, what was I doing? I was at the beach. Bro literally took, he's only 18, he should have been at the club, too hard. That is her motto. And honestly, she kind of slayed with that.